You think you're afraid of being alone, but the truth is, you're just afraid of meeting yourself again. When the noise dies down, when there's no one left to impress, nothing left to distract you, that's when you realize there's nowhere else to run. Carl Jung once said, "Only in absolute silence does the soul begin to speak," and sometimes, that voice isn't as gentle as you hoped. It trembles, it breaks, it shatters the version of you that was built just to survive. But it's there, in that quiet wreckage, that you'll meet the part of you you've abandoned your whole life. And in that darkness, your soul exhales for the very first time. No one's coming to rescue you from yourself, but maybe that's the first gift of awakening. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful at all. It feels like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, like walking into a room where everything stops. No noise, no distraction, no one watching, just you. And suddenly your chest tightens, not because of the silence itself, but because of what it might uncover. You see, we don't really fear silence. We fear what begins to speak inside of us once everything else goes quiet. We fear the voice we've buried, the questions we've avoided, the parts of us we've tried to forget. When you're alone, truly alone, the masks you wear don't matter anymore. There's no audience to perform for, no one to impress. And in that raw stillness, something begins to crack, not outside but inside. I remember a night like that. When the lights were off, the phone was down. No music, no scrolling, just the hum of the fridge and the pounding of my own heartbeat. And then, from nowhere, came a question I hadn't heard in years. "Is this who you really are?" And I froze, because I didn't know how to answer. Carl Jung once said, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know." And that other self, the hidden one, the silent one, starts to surface the moment we stop running. But make no mistake, that moment isn't calm, it's unnerving. It's the kind of quiet that scrapes against your soul, because suddenly there's nothing between you and the truth. No job title to hide behind, no relationship to pour yourself into, no content to drown in, just you, just your breath, just your thoughts. And for many people, that's the most terrifying thing in the world, not being left behind, but being left alone with the unfiltered version of themselves. Because in that state, you realize how much of your life has been built around noise, external voices, deadlines, likes, feedback, roles you never questioned, but played so well you forgot they weren't you. And now all of that is gone, and you're left with a silence that feels like exposure, like standing naked in front of a mirror that doesn't lie, and you wonder, have I ever really met myself? This is not poetic reflection. This is psychological rupture. It's what Jung described as the beginning of the encounter with the self. And it doesn't come gently. It arrives like a weight that pulls you inward, away from the surface of daily life and into the depths of your forgotten identity. You may feel like you're falling, but what's actually happening is a shedding, the first layer coming off. And it stings, but it's also necessary, because the truth is, there is no deeper loneliness than the kind we feel when we are disconnected from who we really are. And no greater relief than the moment we begin to return to that place inside of us. The place we once abandoned to fit in, to be liked, to be safe. And so, when the silence comes, don't rush to fill it. Don't grab your phone, don't escape into noise. Sit with it, even if your hands shake, even if your mind rebels, because that trembling might just be the beginning of waking up. Not to the world, but to yourself. And once you hear that quiet voice inside, the one you've ignored for years, you can't unhear it, and that voice won't scream. It will whisper, "You're still here. I've been waiting," and from that whisper, everything begins to change. We grow up thinking we know who we are, but what if I told you that the version of you that everyone sees, the one that's polite, composed, productive, agreeable, might not be the real you at all? What if that version is just a carefully crafted mask, a collage of behaviors and beliefs shaped by what you thought the world needed you to be, not what you truly are? Carl Jung called this mask the persona, and he warned us that the longer we wear it, the more we start to believe it's our face, not our cover. From childhood we're handed templates, scripts we didn't write but were expected to follow. Be nice, be strong, don't cry, smile for the camera. Suppress what's inconvenient, exaggerate what's praised, and with each moment, we comply. A little piece of our true self retreats into the shadows, not because it's weak, but because it wasn't safe to be seen. So we adapt. We shape ourselves to fit into classrooms, families, jobs, relationships, and over time we stop asking if the roles we play are even ours to begin with. I remember a time when someone asked me, "What do you actually want?" And I realized I didn't know. I could recite my to-do list, my resume, my goals, but I couldn't hear my own desire. It was buried under layers of identity I had performed for years. Jung said, the persona is a system of behavior that is only partially real, and that partial truth is dangerous, because it tricks us into chasing lives that don't belong to us. We end up exhausted, not from living fully, but from maintaining the act. And the most tragic part is, we call this exhaustion success. We call this numbness maturity, but it's not. It's spiritual suffocation, and eventually something inside starts to protest. Quietly at first, in the form of restlessness, boredom, dissatisfaction that can't be explained. You start to feel like an actor who has forgotten the lines, but still must play the scene. And the applause starts to sound hollow. The praise feels disconnected, because deep down you know you've lost something essential. Your truth, but you can't just drop the mask. Not yet, because it's the only face you've known for so long. And worse, it's the face everyone else expects to see. This is where the trap tightens, because the more people admire the mask, the more terrified you become of losing their approval by removing it. It's no longer just about pretending, it's about survival, and so the inner conflict deepens. The true self waits patiently, watching, while the persona keeps performing. But it can't hold forever, because the soul is not meant to be contained. It doesn't thrive under applause. It thrives in truth, in alignment, in breath, and one day, maybe during a quiet walk, a tearful conversation, or a late-night breakdown, the mask begins to slip, and something unfiltered breaks through. Maybe rage, maybe tenderness, maybe silence, and you don't recognize it at first, but it feels alive. It feels real. And that's when you realize the persona wasn't evil. It was protective, it helped you survive, but now it's in the way. Jung believed that individuation, the journey toward wholeness, only begins when we stop mistaking the mask for the self. And that takes courage, because it means unlearning everything you thought made you lovable. It means stepping into a space where your value is not based on performance, but presence. And that's terrifying, but also liberating, because once you begin to see the difference, you can no longer go back. The question now is not who am I to others, but who am I to myself. And if you can stay with that question long enough, without rushing to answer, something true will begin to emerge. There's a moment in life, often quiet and unannounced, when everything you've been pretending to be starts to unravel. It doesn't happen with a dramatic crash. It happens in the in-between, in the space between a conversation and the silence that follows, in the pause after scrolling endlessly and feeling nothing, in the look in the mirror when no one's watching and you don't recognize the eyes looking back. That's the moment when the persona begins to fracture. Not all at once, but like thin glass under pressure. Silent cracks spreading until it no longer holds, and what rises isn't always clarity. It's panic. It's a feeling of disorientation, so real you wonder if you're losing your mind, because everything that once made you feel secure, your titles, your image, your routines, starts to feel distant, artificial, and for a terrifying second, you realize you might not know who you are without them. Carl Jung described this as the collapse of the persona, and he wasn't talking about a mental breakdown, but a spiritual one, a necessary cracking of the outer shell so that something more authentic could begin to emerge. But here's the part no one warns you about. This collapse doesn't feel liberating at first. It feels like death, not physical death, but the death of certainty, of identity, of control. It's the moment you stop being able to answer simple questions like what do you want, or who are you really? And instead of answers, there's only silence. But that silence is sacred, because it's the space where your soul is finally given room to breathe. And yet, it hurts. Not because you're breaking, but because you're realizing how much of your life has been a performance. How many dreams weren't yours. How many choices you made just to keep others comfortable, to stay liked, to be successful. And now that all of that is crumbling, what remains is not a clear path forward, but a void, a strange, formless place where nothing is solid anymore. And in that space, fear shows up. Not the fear of failure, but the fear of being no one, of disappearing, of becoming invisible even to yourself. I've been there, and I know what it feels like, to lie awake wondering if the version of you that people love is just a well-rehearsed illusion. And if you stop performing, will there be anything left to love? But that's the trap, because the persona was never meant to be your prison. It was just a shield. And now that you no longer need it, its collapse is not your end, it's your beginning. Jung believed that in this void, the psyche begins to reorganize itself, and that what feels like the end is actually the first stirrings of the true self. It doesn't speak in loud declarations. It speaks in symbols, images, quiet nudges, a memory resurfacing, a dream that won't let go, a sentence you read that suddenly breaks something open in you, and though you might still feel lost, something inside begins to whisper, "Good, keep going, you're close." This is the part where many people quit, where they rush to rebuild the mask, to return to the comfort of labels and roles. But if you can stay here a little longer, in the not knowing, in the ache of uncertainty, something sacred will begin to take shape. Not a better mask, but a truer face, a quieter strength. Something unshakable because it was born from the wreckage, not built on top of it. This is the first collapse, and though it feels like falling apart, it's actually the first time your soul is being put back together. There's a space no one talks about, the space between who you used to be and who you're becoming. It's not a transition you can measure. It's not a chapter you can label. It's just a strange, suspended silence. Carl Jung called it the creative void, and if you've ever stood in that space, you know exactly why the word void fits, because it feels like floating in the middle of nothing. No old identity to cling to, no new one yet formed, just you and the terrifying awareness that everything familiar has collapsed, and nothing new has arrived to replace it. It feels like failure, like regression, like a cosmic mistake. But that's only if you judge it with the mind that still clings to structure. The void isn't brokenness. It's potential, raw, unshaped, and completely unfamiliar. And that's what makes it terrifying, because we are taught to chase clarity, to always know who we are and where we're going. But the soul doesn't work on those terms. It breaks down the false first, and only then begins to whisper the truth. But in the meantime, there is this emptiness, this psychic limbo, and no one tells you how long it lasts. Sometimes weeks, sometimes years. And it's not quiet in a peaceful way. It's quiet in a way that amplifies every question you've buried. And the longer you stay there, the louder those questions become. Who are you if no one needs you? What do you want if no one's watching? Would you still choose this life if it weren't being applauded? And for many, this is unbearable, because the instinct is to escape, to distract, to rebuild something, anything, just to make the silence stop. But Jung warned us, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And that is what the creative void demands. To face the soul without filters. To sit in the not knowing long enough for something true to rise from the ashes. And that takes courage. Not the kind of courage that wins awards, but the quiet kind. The daily choice to resist filling the space with noise. The decision to sit with your hands in your lap and your heart in pieces and trust that something sacred is coming. And the strange thing is, it often does. Not all at once, and not in the form you expect. Maybe it comes in a line you write, a sudden sense of peace, a tear that makes no sense but heals something. It's in these subtle, almost invisible moments that the self begins to return. Not the old self, but something deeper. A you that's been buried under layers of shoulds and survival. A you that doesn't need to prove anything, just exist. This is the birthplace of authenticity, not born from effort, but from surrender. And it's why so few make it through. Because surrender looks like giving up, feels like losing control, but is actually the beginning of creation. This void, this creative nothingness, is not where life ends. It's where life begins again. But now, on your terms, Jung understood this space intimately. During his retreat at Bo, he experienced long stretches of isolation where images, symbols, and archetypes began to emerge from his unconscious like visitors from another world, and he didn't analyze them immediately. He let them appear. He let the void speak, and from that space came some of his most profound insights. The Red Book wasn't written from clarity. It was written from chaos, from surrender, from silence. And the same applies to us. What if the confusion you're feeling isn't a detour, but the very path? What if you're not lost, just being emptied, so something truer can finally live in you? There's a sacred kind of solitude that doesn't just quiet the world. It opens a doorway inward, and what you find there isn't always peaceful, because solitude, true solitude, is not about silence or stillness. It's about the removal of witnesses. When no one's watching, you're no longer performing. And when you're not performing, things begin to surface. Not all of them beautiful. Carl Jung believed solitude was not just a refuge, but a psychic laboratory. A place where the censored, the repressed, and the denied parts of the self finally find space to emerge. Not because they're evil or broken, but because society told you they were unacceptable. So you pushed them down, again and again, until you forgot they were even yours. But when you're alone, truly alone, the stage is cleared, the lights are off, and there's no one left to judge the strange characters. Stepping out from the shadows, it starts subtly, a random memory, a buried emotion, a thought you would never say out loud. And then it escalates. You begin to feel unfamiliar things, anger you don't recognize, grief that seems too large for what's happening, joy that feels guilty, and it confuses you because it doesn't fit the script of who you thought you were. But that's the point. You're not just one character, you're a cast, a constellation of stories and impulses and contradictions that have been waiting to be seen. Jung called this process shadow integration, and it's one of the most misunderstood yet vital parts of becoming whole. The shadow isn't the enemy, it's the exiled. It's the versions of you that got locked in the basement while the persona got the spotlight. And in solitude, the basement door quietly creaks open, and what walks out may shock you. The perfectionist who is secretly exhausted, the helper who secretly resents being needed, the strong one who secretly wants to fall apart. And the moment you allow these voices to speak, not to dominate, just to exist, something begins to shift, not into chaos, but into truth. You realize you don't have to be only one thing. You don't have to always be composed, or kind, or wise, or productive. You can be messy, tired, angry, confused, and still worthy of love. This is where real authenticity is born, not in front of an audience, but in the dark room of your own reckoning, where nothing is staged and every feeling is raw. Jung warned that what we do not make conscious will come back as fate, meaning if we don't meet our shadows, they don't disappear. They run the show from behind the scenes, shaping our choices, our relationships, our reactions. And so, solitude becomes more than just quiet time. It becomes the space where you get to meet your inner cast, the entire self, not to fix them, but to understand them, and through that understanding, to love them, not in a soft, fluffy way, but in a real way. The kind of love that's fierce enough to say, I see you, even when I don't like you. I honor you, even when you make me uncomfortable, and I won't banish you again. This is the beginning of inner integrity, where the self no longer has to hide from itself. And though it's hard, though it sometimes feels like peeling skin off your soul, it's worth it, because when you emerge from this laboratory, you won't be perfect, but you'll be whole. There comes a moment in solitude when you no longer feel like you're falling apart, but like you're uncovering something ancient, something forgotten. It doesn't arrive with fanfare, it shows up quietly, like an old photo you find tucked between the pages of a book you haven't opened in years. And suddenly, there you are, not the version you've polished for others, but the raw, unfiltered you, the one you were before life told you to tone it down, fix it up, shrink it in, and in that moment, it hits you. You didn't lose yourself, you buried yourself, to survive, to belong, to be loved, and now, piece by piece, that buried self is returning, not as a ghost, but as a guide. And it's strange, because these forgotten versions don't always look graceful. Sometimes they're wild, irrational, childlike, chaotic, but they're real, and they carry a pulse that feels more alive than anything you've shown the world in years. Jung believed that in solitude, the unconscious begins to bloom, not in logical sentences, but in images, impulses, fantasies, and dreams. And when these pieces rise, we often try to shove them back down because they don't fit the persona we've spent so long maintaining. We say, this isn't me, but what if it is? What if that sudden urge to cry over something small is your inner child begging to be acknowledged? What if the strange hunger for silence, nature, or creation is your soul tugging at its leash, trying to remind you that it exists? What if the fantasy you thought was foolish is the seed of your truest purpose? In solitude, these fragments start to speak, not in words, but in sensations, symbols, and synchronicities. And the more you listen, the more you realize you are not just one story. You are a mosaic of selves, each one carrying insight, each one holding a missing piece of your wholeness. The artist in you, the rebel, the mystic, the nurturer, the fierce protector, they've all been waiting for permission to exist, but in a world that rewards simplicity and coherence, we exile complexity, and in doing so, we exile ourselves. Jung wrote that individuation is not about becoming someone new. It's about becoming who you truly are by recovering the pieces you lost along the way. And to do that, you must first stop judging them. Your sensitivity isn't weakness. Your rage isn't failure. Your confusion isn't a flaw. They are messages from the parts of you that have been waiting in the shadows, hoping to be let back in, and when you let them in, something profound happens. You start to feel whole, not perfect, but integrated, like all the pieces finally belong to the same puzzle. And from that inner reunification, something sacred begins to stir. Creativity, intuition, vision, not forced, but flowing, not borrowed, but born from your own depths. And it's this flow that begins to lead you, quietly, steadily, toward a life that no longer feels like performance, but presence. This is why Jung considered solitude a sacred passage, because only when the noise of the world fades do the exiled voices of the soul begin to sing, and when they do, you don't just hear them, you remember them, and through that remembering, you begin to return, not to who the world told you to be, but to the you that always was. Something strange happens when you spend enough time in solitude. Time itself begins to shift. The clock keeps ticking, but it no longer holds power over you. Minutes blur into memories. Hours stretch like old conversations that never ended, and days begin to feel circular instead of linear. Carl Jung experienced this often during his long retreats into silence, and he described it not as a loss of time, but as an expansion of it. When you're no longer rushing from one obligation to the next, your inner world grows louder, and within it, past and future begin to speak, not separately, but at once. You might suddenly remember something from childhood with such clarity it feels like it's happening now, or sense a version of your future self whispering something that makes no logical sense but feels like truth. This is what Jung called personal archaeology, digging through the sediment of memory to find patterns, wounds, unfinished stories still pulling the strings of your present. And what you find can be unsettling, not because it's unfamiliar, but because it's achingly familiar. A recurring fear, a choice you keep making, a person you keep becoming. No matter how hard you try to change, and when you see it clearly, it doesn't just sting, it liberates. Because once you name the pattern, you can stop being its puppet. Solitude gives you this rare gift, the ability to travel through your own timeline, to have conversations you never had, to ask your younger self what they needed, to offer them what they were denied, and more hauntingly, to sit across from your future self and ask, what kind of life did I leave behind? And if you listen closely, they answer, not with words, but with a feeling, an ache, a pull toward something more honest, something more whole. This kind of dialogue doesn't happen in the noise of daily life. It requires stillness, not just physical, but emotional, and it's hard, because it asks you to revisit places you thought you'd outgrown, to look at photos you buried, to replay scenes you swore you were done with, but each time you return, you see with different eyes, with deeper understanding and more compassion, because you're no longer trying to judge who you were, you're trying to understand how you survived, and in that understanding, healing begins. Jung believed that the psyche isn't bound by time the way the body is. It moves in spirals, not straight lines, returning to themes again and again until they're integrated. And that's why certain questions keep showing up in your life, not to torture you, but to invite you to answer them differently this time. Solitude is what opens that door, and on the other side is a deeper kind of presence, not the kind that just exists in the moment, but the kind that stands in many moments at once. Past pain, present awareness, and future possibility, all touching, all informing who you are now. And from this expanded view, your story no longer feels fragmented. It begins to make sense, not because every piece is pretty, but because every piece has a place, and in knowing that, you find a kind of peace no noise could offer. This is the real gift of solitude, not isolation, but integration, a sacred space where time folds. And you begin to realize that the person you've always been waiting for is you, not just now, but always, in every chapter, in every version, in every echo across time. There's a paradox hidden deep within solitude. the more alone you feel, the more connected you become. It doesn't make sense at first. How could silence bring you closer to others? How could isolation become the bridge to something universal? But Carl Jung knew it well, that behind the curtain of our private suffering lies a shared human story. And when you step into the quiet long enough, when the noise of the world finally fades, you begin to hear something ancient, something collective, a hum beneath the surface that tells you you're not the first to feel this way, and you won't be the last. In fact, the grief you carry, the emptiness, the confusion, they don't just belong to you. They echo through generations. They are inherited echoes of unresolved wounds. Jung called this the collective unconscious, a psychic ocean where all of humanity's fears, longings, dreams, and archetypes coexist. And even if you've never heard the term, you've felt it in the ache that comes from nowhere, in the symbols that show up in your dreams, in the way one piece of art or one line in a book can make you cry without knowing why. That's not just your pain. That's the pain of being human. And it's shared, not in a superficial way, but in a soul-deep recognition that we are all walking through versions of the same fire. Solitude makes this visible, because when no one is around to distract you, you begin to sense the invisible threads connecting you to the hearts of others, not as a concept, but as a felt reality. You start to notice that your fear of not being enough is the same fear that has haunted people for centuries, that your longing to be understood is not personal, it is ancestral. And suddenly, you're not isolated, you're initiated into a much older story, one that binds us together in ways modern life tries to make us forget. Jung wrote that when we explore the unconscious, we do not sink into personal chaos, but rather encounter universal order. And in that order, we find patterns, the mother, the orphan, the hero, the wanderer, and we see ourselves in them, not because we're imitating them, but because we are them. Solitude is what lets those archetypes rise. It lets you see that your personal drama is part of a myth much larger than you, and in that shift, your suffering becomes sacred, because it connects you, not separates you. And with that realization comes something even deeper, compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. Because how could you be so harsh on your own fear, when it's the same fear that trembles in every human heart? How could you shame your sadness, when it's part of the same sadness woven through humanity's story? Solitude brings this into focus, not with theories, but with sensation. In stillness, you feel the weight of being human, but also the beauty of not carrying it alone. And from that space, you begin to soften. Not into weakness, but into wisdom. You no longer need to pretend to be untouched by life. You begin to see your cracks not as flaws, but as openings through which shared light enters. And in that light, you see the others. Those who came before, those walking beside you, those yet to come, and you realize you were never alone, only unaware of how deeply you belonged. There comes a moment in solitude where you stop searching, not because you've found the answers, but because the questions themselves dissolve. And in that silence, something dies. But it's not you. It's the version of you that was held together by performance, by noise, by validation. And what takes its place is not a louder identity, but a freer one that no longer needs to be anyone in particular, just to be. And this death isn't tragic, it's sacred. Because the persona you let go of was never fully alive. It was a beautiful mask crafted out of fear, expectation, and childhood survival. But it was heavy, exhausting, and ultimately false. Carl Jung once wrote, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning." And in that, he reminded us, the old self must die so the soul can live. Solitude is the funeral and the rebirth. It strips you bare until you can no longer pretend. And in that rawness, something astonishing happens. You realize you are still here, without the labels, without the applause, without the need to be useful, and you're not empty, you're real. When the ego dies, what remains is not nothingness, but presence, aliveness, something ancient and unbreakable, not because it's made of stone, but because it flows like water, soft, persistent, free. And in that space, you stop being afraid of being alone, because you see now, solitude was never the prison. It was the door, and the loneliness you feared was only the echo of your own resistance to stillness. But now, you're still, and something quiet within you begins to breathe again. The part of you that doesn't hustle, doesn't perform, doesn't apologize for existing. This is the return to self, to soul, to source, and with that return comes Freedom, not the kind you earn, but the kind you remember, like a dream you almost forgot. Like a truth you knew as a child, but lost in the noise. Now it's back, and it's simple. You're enough. Not because you proved anything, but because you came home. This is the paradox Jung pointed to, that the deeper we descend into the self, the more we expand into the world. That only through surrender can we be truly held, and only through dying to the false can we live into the real. Solitude gives us that death and that life, not in separate phases, but as a single act of becoming. So if you're here now, sitting in the silence, wondering if something is wrong with you, let me tell you, nothing is wrong. Something is ending, and that is sacred. Don't rush to fill the space. Let it open, let it echo. Let it carry the voice of your soul all the way back to you. This silence is not empty. It's the sound of your freedom returning.